right. Are people coming in? Yes, they are. All right. Hi, folks. Thanks for coming this evening. We'll take a few minutes to let everybody come on board here. And I found out, or it was clarified for me just a short time ago, this is a webinar rather than sort of the Zoom meeting format that many of us spend our days on. And, you know, you're welcome as you come on to maybe say your name in the chat and where you're located. If you know the Indigenous place name, it would be great to include that. I see lots of familiar names on the participant list and some new ones as well. So welcome everybody. Take a few more minutes here. Maybe we could have, if people were able to watch the Rights of Nature documentary, maybe you can find a way to indicate it in the chat with yes or no. It'd be interesting to get a sense of what information people are entering this meeting with. Great. I'm really glad people have had a chance to watch the documentary. That's great. Michelle, I see you weren't able to watch it. If you go on the, well, we'll give the website, but Public Herald has the rights for the documentary. And I think you can still pay to watch it. And in fact, I ended up joining or signing up for the Public Herald, which it turns out is a really great source of articles and videos. And if you sign up, then I think it's $1 to watch the documentary, but you pay a monthly fee. Hi, Nina. So we got the screening rights for 24 hours. So it expires as we begin this Q&A this evening. Hi, Tina. Hi, Adam. Great.
Hi, guys.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I see there's also a live transcript available for anybody who would like that as well. I think you can just click on the CC at the bottom. All right. So listen, I'm gonna start here, and people can continue to file in, but we're hoping to go an hour. So I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I am speaking from Chibuktuk, which is on Mi'kmaq territory, the territory of Mi'kmaqi. And this evening I listened to, for the second time, a land acknowledgement given recently by Chief Hugh Akagi from the I'm struggling with the pronunciation here, but Pescamaquoddy Nation. And the reason I re-listened to it was because it was so powerful. And he described, he begins by, or one of the things he says is that unceded is a nice word for stolen. And so he said, I will not use that word. And he talks about how the word unceded reinforces the image of the noble Indian. And it sort of covers up the fact that land has been stolen and that there was a crime and a criminal. And so I've thought a lot about that since I first heard him speak a few months ago, and I've gone back to it and included it in my email signature now, rather than saying I'm on the unceded territory of Mi'kmaqi. I say I'm on the stolen land of Mi'kmaqi. He also points out that you won't actually find the word unceded in the standard dictionary. But if you go and look up the word cede, C-E-D-E, it means to yield or surrender as by treaty. And he points out, and these are his words, this is how the oppressor puts ideas into our head. So I just invite everybody to, contemplate that, that somehow we've been taught as settlers to think that we are living in peace and friendship on land that was, that there were treaties involved and so on, but that's stolen land. So what does it mean to own a home on stolen land or rent a property? So next I'll introduce some of the great people who are presenting this evening. We have 3 people from CELDF, and I'm sure you know from all the emails and reminders we've sent out that CELDF stands for the community. See, now I've forgotten what the Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And so I'll introduce our 3 presenters. Markie is an organizer in addition to working with CELDF. She is a volunteer organizer with the Toledans for Safe Water and the Ohio Community Rights Network. She's also an ambassador for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. That's impressive. And the rights of nature, and has spoken at the United Nations. And Ben Price was one of CELDF's first community organizers. He joined the staff in 2002, and he's also participated in the founding of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. And he also has a book that I'm curious to check out one of these days called How Wealth Rules the World, Saving Our Communities and Freedoms from the Dictatorship of Property. And Tish O'Dell is a community organizer as well. And for the past 10 years, she's been involved in community rights and the rights of nature work, beginning in her home community of Iowa. And she's worked with communities all over the country and all over the world. And she's also a lecturer in their democracy school, which I hope you'll tell us more about a little further into the call. We also have two folks here, well, several folks, but two that I can see on my screen from the newly formed Rights of Nature Network for Atlantic Canada, and that is Colin Rotsiart and Adam Malcolm. And so they'll be chatting with us as well in the chat. And you'll also see Allie's name and Ocean periodically in the chat, and they work with the Atlantic chapter of the Sierra Club, and they're supporting this call. So actually, if you have any technical problems on the call, please don't ask me to help because I'll be useless, but reach out to Allie or Ocean and they'll help sort you out. All right. Okay, so this call is being live streamed on our Facebook site, the Sierra Club Atlantic site. Hello to everybody joining us from Facebook. And this is primarily gonna be a question and answer period. And I will kick off with a couple of questions, but people are encouraged to add questions in the chat or to put them in the Q&A, which you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And those will be shared through, I'll ask your questions on your behalf to the panelists we have here this evening. All right, so I'm going to kick it off with one question. So some of the people who were on the, or who watched the documentary, Invisible Hand, may recognize themselves in some of the stories that are presented in the documentary. And while the names and places are different and so on, the plot seems frighteningly familiar. And yet, I know that I have a habit of thinking, you know, well, anything south of the border is going to be worse than what's happening here. So I'm curious whether or not you would agree or dispel that idea that somehow what we all watched in that documentary is describing something that's more American than not. And that's open to anyone any of you who wants to kick it off.
Well, I'll kick it off since No, and it kind of made me laugh when I like heard you ask that question, Tynette. I'm like, I don't know. I'd ask you guys. I don't know. What do you think? Are things better really there in Canada? Is it less? You don't have any pollution there? And I'm thinking back when you asked that to the Lake Erie Bill of Rights when it passed, and because obviously it got a lot of media attention. And I remember we got calls from TV stations and reporters in Canada, and they were like asking us like, oh my God, this law passed in Toledo, on the other side of Lake Erie. What's that going to mean for Canada? Like, are we going to not be able to do certain things because of it? And I just laughed, because I'm like, well, I don't know. Let's see if we can clean up Lake Erie, in the Northwest Ohio part, so that Western basin there, doesn't the water kind of just flow then maybe? And maybe Canada will have cleaner water. So, it's just an interesting, this whole idea of these borders and trying to look at nature differently. That's the whole thing, that the ecosystem doesn't see the borders. I mean, Lake Erie doesn't know where Ohio ends and Pennsylvania begins, or the United States ends and Canada begins. But we create those borders. And yeah, so no, I think the elected leaders pretty much, I think that's a fallacy, at least in my opinion, to believe that it's, better somewhere else. That's why we're all on this planet together, and we're all facing climate change. We're all facing ecological collapse of many of the ecosystems.
I see people are supporting your answer here in the chat, talking about the experiences that they've had in Salt Spring Island on BC and in Charlottetown, PEI. Yeah. And I think one thing that I find a little slippery here is that the politicians smile and pat you on the back as they're actually doing stuff that, would contravene protecting the environment. But it's a little harder to sort of read them sometimes because they can do it with a smile.
Hi, this is Ben Price. Yeah, Tynette, your question. I've been doing community organizing for about 17 years, and most of the communities I'm invited into, I hear from folks there who say, I know you work with a lot of different places, but our place is unique. And one thing I can tell you is none of them are unique. They all have their own particular issues and their own particular personalities that are involved in it and all of that. But the systems, the structures of law, the rules that confine us and stop us from actually protecting our local environment and our families' health and safety, they're very similar throughout the United States. Each of the states have their own set of laws that vary on how, for instance, municipalities relate to their states. And when I look at Canadian provinces and the municipalities and counties in Canada, it's very similar. The parallels are very close. And the problems are very close. When I say the problems, yeah, there's the environmental, but there's also the problems of trying to get your local officials and your provincial officials to hear you. And yeah, they're practiced at smiling. They're practiced at trying to get reelected. They're not very practiced at coming through for the communities and for the environment. And that's common across the borders, I'd say.
Yeah, and this is Markie in Toledo. I guess I would just add to that, say I think it's almost more dangerous to assume you're being represented when you're not. And when we're making a lot of noise, sometimes it's like, oh, they have a problem, but we don't, because if we did, then the people I elected would be making noise about it. And I think there's that sort of misconception that, you need to be the one that brings this attention. And yeah, it's like you look at it like an equation, and some of those variables, they're different, but whatever the issue is, the system is the same. And you need to start looking at, well, what are the different variables I can plug in, rather than saying, well, if the problem changes, the solution changes, or if my tactic changes. That problem can be different, but you're still stuck in the same equation. And that needs to get you thinking differently about how you proceed with this problem. And I certainly don't think it's uniquely American, but I see that, you know, I get that idea put forward to me all the time that, oh, there must, like, I've never heard of algae, this being toxic. Is that just a Lake Erie problem? It's like, no, that's everywhere. It's all over. Once you start looking at it, you start seeing it all over. But it's, Lake Erie is kind of the squeaky wheel, so it got a lot of that attention.
Yeah, it's interesting because this evening I listened to the news report on the blue-green algae in Grand Lake here. And some of the people interviewed haven't been able to use the water for 5 days. And one person was saying, boy, I never realized how much water we used. But nowhere in that news report did it refer to the fact that this was caused by climate change. They did mention that, you know, warmer temperatures and so on, but it still seems very hard to, you know, call it, you know, or you have to go digging or, you know, talk to somebody like yourselves who's like, you know, this is kind of crazy, isn't it? You know, like this is happening, but we're pretending it's not happening. What do you do with that?
It's hard to really tackle that narrative of this is nature's fault and we didn't contribute to it. I noticed going back to some of the old newscasts and things for Libor, I'm catching things I didn't catch up front. And, you know, when I was in that moment and hearing officials say there was nothing we could have done to prevent this from happening, with was the amount of the rain that we had, and it's the warmer temperatures, and it's all these things. We put so much focus on things we have no control over, and divert all of that attention and energy because there's this unwillingness to really tackle and change the things that we do have control over. And so we sort of force people into that role of, you know, there's something you can do when it's the climate. You can't control how much rainfall there is. You can't control the temperature outside. That's what caused the problem. And it's okay for us to start pushing back on that narrative, and we really need to.
One of the lines in the documentary that really stood out for me was something you said, Ben, about how change only happens when people wake up to the fact that nobody's going to save them. And, you know, when I heard that, and even when I repeat that, a part of my heart clenches, you know, it's like, oh, but, you know, it's a hard thing to swallow, you know, because we feel like we've entrusted, you know, regulators, government officials, elected officials to have our backs. And I know, speaking with people around the region, you know, a lot of people have learned the hard way that that is not the case, and they've been betrayed, but not everybody is aware. So how do you help people come to their own realization of this? Because people aren't going to believe it just because you say it.
Well, Tynette, it's over the years, it's become a little bit easier because more and more people are exposed to the simple fact that their government, their elected officials aren't actually responsive. And when I say that, it's not just that they're all corrupt. It's mostly that the system has been corrupted over time, that the laws, the regulations, and the rest of it have been hijacked so that they protect the interests of industry and profit making and not the interest of communities and our health and the environment. Initially it was very difficult because people wanted to believe that their government and their laws represented their interests, and they were very loath to believe that that they don't, and that there's no way to resolve the problems that face us. That's a that's a point where people they give up. I've heard so many elected officials say, well, there's so much apathy in the community. They don't come to meetings. They don't really tell us what they need. And then when after talking to so many people in their communities, it's clear to me the reason that they're not engaged is because they know they can't create the outcomes that they want by asking their local officials, their county officials, their provincial or state officials. And so how can they come to understand that that's really the case? Our initial tactics were to run through people through the gamut, have them, okay, try to protect your local environment. Let's pass some local laws. Let's see what happens. And what happens almost inevitably is that they're sued by a corporation who enlists the government and the courts to bring about an overturning of the local law that would have protected the people's health from toxic landfills, from injecting frack waste into the ground, same ground where their well water comes from. And what we find is that what the system protects is the interests of wealth and the corporate interests who, simply put, they finance the campaigns of the legislators who are elected, who make the laws and make the regulations. So exposing people firsthand to see that that's how it works, it's painful, but it's one way to wake people up. The other is for the rest of the people in communities surrounding to see what's happened and to learn from that. And I think there's a growing awareness of the dire straits we're in, and that we are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody else is going to help us. There's no one with a white hat riding into town to make it all right for us.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
This is Tish. Can I add to that, Tynette?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that the movie is really good at showing, because they do bring in indigenous communities as well as, us white colonizers, right? And that's part of our problem and our mindset. And why we say that this movement really, even though indigenous people don't call it rights of nature, that's us, because we're so conditioned and colonized in our own minds to believe in this colonizer government and the way it's been set up. That's why we're looking for someone to save us, right? Our electeds or whatever, because that's what we've been taught. And you hear people say that this movement to protect nature, whether we call it rights of nature, whatever name we give it, really needs to be indigenous led, because it's their culture that understands that nature isn't just there as property to be used and abused by us, that we have a responsibility and an obligation to protect it, and that we're part of nature. And that's something we as white people have to learn, and we can learn it from indigenous people. And so that's why I think the film is really good, because it brings in communities, different communities, both indigenous and of the colonizer mindset, to kind of show that.
And maybe that's something we can talk a little bit more about, because I think some people may have thought of the rights of nature movement. With rights of nature, you're giving a river or an ecosystem, sort of making it a legal entity that has rights in the court of law. And so it is, in a way, sort of calling it property, which obviously would not be how the indigenous view of land or water or ecosystems would be presented. So can you talk a little bit about that tension, and how, is it just because you have to have a way to fight in court?
This has been, it's not about just having a way to fight in court, because frankly, the courts are not, in our view, not the last place to make the decision. It's the communities, the people living there who have the right to defend and protect their own local ecosystems and their own health and safety. As we see it, as I see it, it's when I say the word community, I mean people and their natural environment. That's not exactly where native or indigenous folks would be. It's really about being related, having a relationship with the land, and the relationship that Western societies and the justification for conquest was that humans are above and separate from and superior to nature. And nature has the status legally of nothing but possession of property that can be exploited and used. And of course, that whole sense of superiority also extended to other cultures of human beings and treating them like property, and the whole idea of enslavement. It's the Western European empires really lost their way in terms of their relationship, not just to the planet and to the environment, but to other human beings. And they did it. They fleshed it out in what are considered grand philosophies of the Enlightenment, which really are simply propaganda to justify the genocide, the ecocide, and the plunder and conquest. That's a hell of a tradition to bear.
Yeah, and I can just add a little bit to that. This is Markie. I think when we started in Toledo, it was easy. It was an easy concept for us to grasp, to say, okay, personhood, legal personhood for Lake Erie. Let's shift it from property to this other, form of being a rights-bearing entity. But that is something now I try to discourage a little bit, because even personhood has, a legal definition. We don't want to create responsibilities and duties for ecosystems. We're trying to create something more unique for them. And I think a lot of it is, as Tish and Ben have kind of mentioned, we've sort of been trained and conditioned to think in this way of rights mean this, and this is what it means to be a person. And so trying to discourage that, to say also that we're not just trying to give rights and assign rights, but recognize them. And it's making that shift of saying, this is not me declaring that I have the power to make something that has been property into a person or into a rights-bearing entity, but saying this ecosystem has inalienable rights, and these rights have been ignored. And we have an obligation to now recognize them and uphold them and do things differently. So I think it's just these little ways that we start to change our perspective and our mindset. And still now, when I read about different rights of nature efforts going on, you see some people say, yeah, personhood, and some people say it differently. And maybe personhood to some groups is more about making that connection. And but we need to remember that that does have a legal definition as well. So we do need to be careful about the way we talk about it, but recognize that this is a journey we go on, and we have this evolution of thought. And it's okay to kind of stumble through that, because we're trying to figure this out and bring something really new to, at least to our culture, right? We're using these traditional teachings and this knowledge, but we're trying to find space for it in our culture, and recognizing that means some things need to go, and that's where the conflict comes in.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I see we have some questions piling up here from folks on the call. One of the questions we had first was, what are the differences between the rights of nature and stop ecocide? Are they trying to achieve the same goals? Are their methods different? Like and stop ecocide being sort of capitalized as a movement in the same way that rights of nature is.
I'll give I think a quick answer, and that's that the stop ecocide is putting it in terms of criminality and punishment. And I think that what we need is prior to that, instead of punishing what's been done after the fact, prevent the ecocide, prevent it. And it means we're asking for something really big, which is a paradigm shift, change of mind, that we need a cultural shift that recognizes that we're part of nature and what harms it harms us, that we can't destroy the natural world and not ourselves be destroyed or severely harmed. It's not just about self-interest either. It's about having responsibilities. I mean, rights imply responsibility, that we have a responsibility to the natural world. You could say the same thing about other human beings. We have a responsibility not to murder them. And once we have, then we can be charged with the crime of murder. Well, once we've destroyed an ecosystem, perhaps there can be a charge of ecocide and consequences for it. But frankly, that's no better than having the genocide and then claiming war crimes. That does not solve a thing. Finding a way to define it as a horrible crime does not prevent it from happening. And if we think that we're going to scare people into destroying the planet, they're not scared yet.
Sadly, yes. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, someone has written, they're from a small village in northern New Brunswick, and a few years ago, people in the community fought against and won, fought against a plant that planned to burn creosote from the United States. I've never heard of creosote, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Now unemployment is high and many people have moved away. So this person's question is, how do we help our communities thrive after a win? And do we have an obligation to help?
Yeah, this is Tish. I always love when I hear the words win and loss in a sentence. Markie knows she's laughing. Because that's another thing we have to flip in our brains, right? What's a win and what's a loss? We're so conditioned to believe like if we win an election, that's a win. And if we lose the election, that's a loss. Or in Lake Erie's case again, because you saw that in the film, right? That the court overturned it. They passed the law, so that's a loss. But I don't view that as a loss because that's why we're all here. I mean, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is a win in my books. It always will be, because it did so much to spread the idea about nature and nature's rights and all of us being connected to nature. So that'll always be a win that can't be taken away. And a movement is going to constantly have these, little gains, and then they get pushed back. And then maybe the next community picks it up. And that's why it's so important you watch the film, and that you will take this in your community, push it to the next level, and then maybe it gets pushed back, but it keeps building. We're planting seeds constantly, and as it spreads, that's the win. And so in that community, in traditional means, when you can move that plant out of your community, that's seen as a win. But when you look at the bigger picture of nature as a whole and the planet and ecosystems, they probably just moved it somewhere else, into someone else's community. So it may be, it all depends what lens you're looking through. We see that a lot with waste dumps and things like that. Like, communities fight so hard to keep it out of their community, but then it goes into another community, or the big factory farms, they'll just push it out. So we have to be very careful, this whole defining what's a win and what's a loss and what are we actually fighting for in the long term. And so, I mean, that community, I would take, you know, you need to redefine the community yourself, and not in the terms of the capitalist system that it's about, you know, these jobs and you're going to make money. What can you do in that community to come together and make yourself sustainable and support each other? And that's kind of we see our work and our movement moving towards that, to creating alternative systems. What does it mean to have a healthy and just community? And again, that idea we already had talked about, looking to other people to save you, but no, you as the community and the people who have this connection to place have to develop that yourselves and implement it yourselves.
I think one of the, you know, the things that we hear all the time, and I'm sure you've heard it many times as well, is that, well, people need jobs, right? And that's sort of what I hear in the person's question from New Brunswick. And here near Chibuktuk, we have this issue that we refer to as Owl Heads Provincial Park. So the government secretly delisted a piece of land that everybody thought was a park and was calling a park for years and years. Anyway, sold it to a developer, or delisted it so that it could be sold to a developer to build a golf course, probably a few golf courses and a resort. And so the narrative becomes, you know, the folks who want and need the jobs versus the environmentalists who are trying to save, you know, a nice ecosystem. So, you know, one of the people in the chat is asking, you know, how could the rights of nature movement be used in this case, for example, and how, I think the additional question I'm bringing to it is, how do you fight the jobs loss narrative?
So yeah, this has been the question is, what are jobs for, and is, do we really, is it jobs that we need, or do we need to have sustainable communities and healthy food and clean air and things that won't cause us to get cancer and so forth? You know, if jobs were the main important thing, I use a horrible kind of a comparison, but you know, it's illegal to hire a hitman to go commit murder for you. But you know, you pay the guy or the gal a lot of money, and heck, that's an income. That's a job. I guess we should legalize murder so that we have jobs. Look, you can't justify jobs if the job of the people doing the job is to do harm to the community, to the world. That's not a justification for creating those jobs. And so our question is, you know, is it even jobs? Is wage slavery really the best we can do in terms of how people can live in the 21st century and into the future? Or do we need to rethink how we've structured our communities? Maybe that's the problem, is that we've built a system that guarantees the gradual destruction of the world. You know, people say we've got regulatory agencies, and what they do is they regulate the rate of destruction. They don't actually protect the environment. They regulate how fast it's going to be utterly destroyed, which guarantees it will be utterly destroyed. And so will we. Now, I don't know who can make an argument to make sense of that for me, but you know, it'll be a miracle.
Yeah, and I think the government generally is just not very creative. They think, you know, that golf courses somehow are going to create a lot of jobs, and they're willing to support that as opposed to something that the environmental groups would suggest instead. Nina had a question about the relationship between the rights of nature movement and the front lines of civil disobedience. So as she explains in the documentary, someone points out that there are front lines wherever resources are being extracted. How does civil disobedience factor into the rights of nature movement?
I can get us started. I'm probably not the most well-versed on this topic, but I think any time that you're trying to propose this and trying to move these efforts forward, it's a form of civil disobedience. When you're told, no, you can't do this. No, this is not allowed. No, we're going to keep you off the ballot. No, this, you don't have the right to do this. And in your persistence, that's your way of saying, I feel that I do. And whether you tell me yes or no, I'm going to do this anyway. That's probably not the form of civil disobedience we think of when we think of other places like Standing Rock and, people who are actually physically standing in the way of things coming in. But so this is just another way of doing that. And, it's going to take everything. We understand that the courts are going to be the last thing that are going to fall and change. They're going to be the last thing to say, yeah, we concede, we accept rights of nature. That cultural shift has to happen. And I think one of the ways that you do that is getting people engaged, starting at the grassroots, having, as Tish mentioned before, that local voice, that local, information and knowledge, really shaping how this looks and pushing back when they're told no, to say, the laws that I have to abide by are man-made, and start looking at them as sort of these arbitrary systems that we created. And maybe we need to adhere to what these natural systems are trying to tell us, what they dictate, what they say the limits are, rather than trying to create regulations and create laws that we need to live by. So I think just in general, you're told, no, this is illegal, this is unconstitutional, and you become the advocate for it regardless, because whether or not you're going to see it, this is the world you want to live in, and you're trying to create that, whether that's something you're going to witness or future generations are going to witness. You just have to tune out all the no's and from the authorities and those regulating bodies that try to stand in your way.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Markie said, because this paradigm shift we keep talking about, and that rights of nature laws, these communities, that are featured doing this, that's only one paradigm shift, in the law. There's so many, and I guess doing this work and seeing this, and like what you said, Markie, it's so true that, anytime you stand up, you have passion, you believe that what you're doing is just and right. And so you don't cave, like you just don't give up because the government says, oh, your law is illegal or you can't do this. It's this belief that is in your gut, like, no, we have to do this. And you keep pursuing whatever whichever avenue you can take that you can think of. And you said something, Tynette, about, well, I guess governments aren't that creative. And I laugh because I'm thinking, but guess what? People in communities are. They're very creative. Every community I've come, into, and they face a problem, they have a ton of ideas on how they could solve it. I think COVID showed a lot of that, how creative communities can be in, coming up with new ways and systems to protect and help people in their community. And it's the government and the laws a lot of times that are standing in their way. And we can't let that then be in the way and say, oh, well, we can't do that. If it's a good idea and that this would be benefit to your community, then do it, make it happen.
This has been it. Just to add one little bit, just to say that when we're told we cannot protect our own communities and our own local environments, we're being told that it's illegal for us to protect them. That's the thing. And we're being told that it's perfectly legal for them to be destroyed to make a profit. It's upside down. And when we engage in direct action and civil disobedience, we're actually obeying a law that says that we have a perfect right to defend our communities, our own health and safety, and the environment, the natural environment that our lives depend on, and that future generations depend on. Because if extracting every last dime of wealth and value out of the planet has to happen as fast as possible, it's essentially saying that we don't need to have any more generations of anything, of anything. And so, yes, we're justified in not just disobeying, but breaching and challenging and overturning laws that violate our right to life. It's that simple.
Okay, you say it's simple. I'm going to ask you. No, I totally get what you're saying. One thing maybe all three of you could weigh in on is tactics. So, you know, is civil disobedience the most effective way, or does it depend? And you know, it's like you have folks who feel they have to spend the majority of their time submitting recommendations to government, or you know, I know people here on this call have worked really hard on petitions, and the Owl's Head petition now has 25,000 signatures, so kudos to you folks. And also the Stop Clear Cutting folks managed to get a ton of petitions, signed rather. But you know, clear cutting is going ahead, and the government isn't sort of answering questions about Owl's Head. So, I mean, do you discourage that line of effort, or is all of it necessary?
Maybe I'll just answer quickly to say that it's all necessary until people understand that it's all futile. The fact is that the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was placed on the ballot through petitioning, lots of signatures. And then a lot of people went out and voted, and they got, well, I think it was 67%, or correct me, the number was high. So in a democratic process, the people chose to protect the rights of Lake Erie and to defend it against polluters who were making a lot of money by not being responsible for what they were doing. And then that was overturned. And so if you think that signatures on a petition begging legislators to do the right thing is going to have more impact than people passing a law and having it overturned anyway in order to protect the interests of corporate agriculture, in this instance, was one of the real beneficiaries of it. Well, I think it's naive. And so is direct action necessary? Well, you wish it wasn't. We wish we could make local laws and they'd stick and they'd be enforceable, and that would be that. And we'd protect the environment. And we're being told, no, you can't. That's not okay. And so the more severely the rights of the people and of the environment are restricted, the more severely will they come back to push back. It's a confrontation. And hopefully enough people will stand up and do this, enact local rights of nature laws, insist on their enforcement, insist they not be overturned. You know, we need to have a movement of people. We don't have a big enough movement right now. It must be very plain to those who keep manipulating the system that they're not going to get away with it anymore. Until we get there, we won't have tipped the scales.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. For sure. I mean, I feel like wherever you start, you quickly realize that you need to add more. If you start with civil disobedience, you eventually find yourself in the organizing world, and vice versa. You start with organizing, you're gonna, figure out that you need to add other tactics there. There's not a necessarily like a right way to do this. There's no handbook that says these are the steps you must take. And in our case, in Toledo, these were physical signatures we went out to collect, not online. And so I think sometimes people assume that we were just, circulating an online petition or something, but that was not the case. But yeah, it just really depends on how much you put into it. I'm sort of at the point where I'm done with begging and pleading for help, for some kind of assignment of value from elected officials, from bodies of authority. And, you look at the case of Lake Erie and think this has been going on for decades, you've done nothing. And it's our turn to have some power and to make some decisions. That being said, it's a little more difficult to stand in front of nutrient pollution than it is stand in front of a bulldozer. So your tactics change, that whatever your battle is, whatever your issue is, you really have to take those opportunities. But sometimes I think too, it's about saying, okay, there's a public hearing. How are you going to use it? Are you going to legitimize it and say, I want my concern on record? Or are you going to go and speak to the people instead of speaking to, the people there to take your comment down? Are you going to call it out for what it is, that it's just for show? And so you have to get smart about how you use those opportunities and start changing the game. Don't play by the rules that you're given, make a new path. And it's going to be different. And it's going to depend on the community. It's going to depend on what's at stake. It's going to depend on how much time you have to confront this.
Yeah, I would just add to that. This isn't an either or, situation, and civil disobedience comes in many different forms, direct action. So for example, what we're trying to always do, I think, is show the people in the community. I mean, government is supposed to be representative of the people. It's of, by, and for the people. That's why we create government. And so it's to actually, because they can't believe it, is to expose that it's not. And so at that point, it becomes an illegitimate government, at least in my mind. And so all these things help show people that. I mean, and what we see is when people do direct action, like the Standing Rocks and all that, and actually, they didn't stop the pipeline, but what did they do? They exposed the system. And now we see them passing laws, more draconian laws, right, to stop people from doing protests. So people have to question, do we really, what's this government doing? I mean, it's bringing in police to stop, to be used against its own citizens. They're trying to protect their water or whatever, it is. And so it gets people thinking. And the same thing with the petitions and the laws. I mean, the petitions are a way to educate people about what's really happening. It gets the conversation going. And if it is, say it's a community to put those petitions like Toledo to put something on the ballot, and the system says, no, you can't do that. We're not going to let you vote on it. Then the people in that community should hold their own election. Let's have a people's election. So it's about taking all these things, and we have to think strategically, think what we're really trying to do. It is a movement, as Ben said. And so this is all about, I mean, if you look at the movements of the past, it wasn't one particular thing, and when the government said, oh, you can't do this, they didn't back down and go, oh yeah, we can't. We had women suffragettes, right, who went and voted, put their votes in, even though it was illegal. That didn't stop the movement when they got arrested and the court, ruled against them. So it's that same kind of mentality. If you believe in this, you're going to keep fighting and pushing forward no matter what the system does to you, even if it means creating alternative systems.
Yeah, and I think what all three of you are saying loud and clear is that you're not just pushing back on the system. You're saying, we're not going to play by your rules, that we see the game is rigged and it is not legitimate, and therefore we will find our own means to protect the land and the creatures and people on it. So I mean, it's kind of a huge transmission you're giving us here, a huge teaching. One of the things I wanted to get to, and I know we're closing in on time here, but is the challenge of how things get co-opted. So, you know, one of the questions people had, you know, talks about how even the rights of nature, that language is being co-opted by the Democratic Party in Florida, for example. And so it's a little bit like, you know, how the word clean energy or the term clean energy gets greenwashed. And so how do you deal with that slippery slope? Like one minute you think you're fighting for something, and then the politicians or the corporations are saying, yes, we want that too. And then you're kind of like, well, but what exactly?
So
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I'll start. I know all three of us are eager to jump on this one, so I'll just get us started. Yeah, I mean, and that's such a big concern right now because rights of nature is turning into this really mainstream, really sexy idea that can really quickly be taken over. And you think the goal is let's hand it over, let's put it up high. And I really feel like this is why it's so important. And I know we've said this already on this call tonight, but keeping local voices as really the enforcers of this, as the ones who maintain and use the local knowledge. And that to me is what's going to keep the integrity of this movement, to know that what rights of nature looks like in my community might look a little different in someone else's, because there are different systems that have different needs and different ways of functioning. So we need to really remain active and engaged and participate in this. And this is going to have to become one of those forever kind of things, because it's not just let's put it in the law book and go about our day. We need to make this part of our culture. It needs to be more about how we live every day, how we create jobs, how we really form and mold our society. And that is really at risk when we hand the power over to other bodies and even people that we elect. We really need to stay engaged in this.
Right. It's interesting. The co-option is not only do they steal everyone's land, when I say they, it's that imperial idea that's build an empire, the bigger the better, centralize power and let's centralize wealth. They steal our language too. And they privatize consciousness. I mean, the whole media thing that you're bombarded with, commercials everywhere. You get online and every site you're on that you think is for your use is actually for whoever owns the site to sell your eyes to the people selling the products they're advertising. The theft of ideas like rights of nature shouldn't shock us. It's not something new. I think that it means that we have to understand rights of nature in the context that we have been discovering is more appropriate. So when we talk about community rights, rights of nature is part of community rights. If we see community as including people and the world around them, all the living things, all of the rest of the planet, and who has responsibility for protecting the rights of the people and the rights of the ecosystem. Well, it's the people living in it. It's place-based. It's becoming indigenous ourselves in a sense. It's saying that we have the authority to define the rights of nature here. And that means you can't come in and do something that harms the water, the aquifer, the river, the streams, poisons the air, the soil, creates a situation where our food is unhealthy. I mean, who should make those decisions? not someone at the capital of your state, your province, or your nation, but the community collectively making decisions in a democratic way. That's community rights, and that's rights of nature to me, all in one place. And it takes it out of the hands of the powerful to make those decisions if we can arrive at seeing it that way.
I'll bring up a point that Adam raised, because he made a presentation last night to his municipal council, and he was making a case for the rights of nature. And he, although there was some interest on the council and some members of the community, many of the people, involved with the council and the community at large are employed by the pulp mill and the biomass plant and the coal-fired power plant and so on, which are causing environmental harm. So sometimes that, what's in the interest of the community can be very mixed, right? People who are working for these industries or whose children are working for those industries. So how do you work with that community tension?
I'll say that if it was not a pulp mill, but I don't know, let's say they were manufacturing addictive drugs. Everybody had a job. We would say no, that's not, it's still bad for the community, so that shouldn't be allowed. We won't have those jobs. We're going to have to arrive at a point where we understand that an industry that's set up to continue the destruction of the natural climate and the forests they're being clear cut and the rest of it, that they're violating the rights of nature and the rights of the community in which nature is a member and in which people are members. They're violating those rights. Now, if we want to talk about ecocide, you want to talk about what should be illegal. It shouldn't be protecting your community. It should be destroying that community from the interests of profit. It's hard to see very quickly how a change in worldview would fix so many things. Well, what happens to the jobs and the rest of it? Jobs don't stay around forever. The pulp mill won't be there forever. And when it's gone, those people will be just as dependent on, we need to do something, we need to have income. It seems to make more sense to fix it in the short term rather than the long term after the harm's been done. And after all the paychecks have been spent on plastic things that are in the landfill by now. We have a lot of things that we have to fix, it seems like, but some of them can be fixed by changing the way we see the world. And that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, I see this a lot in the communities I've dealt with, and Youngstown is the one that comes to mind, Ohio. They were a steel town, and then the steel mills left. They went to places where they could get labor cheaper. There was no commitment to the community from the steel mills, and then they left the people there. Now fracking has come in, and you see things where it's a French company, where in France they've banned fracking, but they want to frack in that community, and they build, they're bringing in a manufacturing plant to make the pipes. So I said, what they're giving you the choice is poisoning your children and your water to have a job. I mean, that's just such a horrible, that's that whole colonizer mindset all over again. They're colonizing the community. They're colonies for these corporations. And I understand people do want to put food on the table. They want a roof over their heads, but to be dependent on that and to become almost like slaves to these corporations is what you are. I mean, you're selling your children's future in order to have a job today. And that's a horrible position to be in. But at some point, we're going to have to all make a decision, you know, and like Ben was saying, I mean, if it was a company that was making, you know, poisons, you know, pharmaceuticals or drugs that, you know, were causing addictions and heroin, would you want that in your community? Probably not, even if it was bringing jobs. So, I mean, I know they're tough decisions and it's tough, but I think we need to start talking more openly about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sure a lot of people on this call want to know how to go forward. I know many people are dealing with issues, you know, close to home. And so how, first of all, maybe you can begin by just sharing how CELDF works with communities and what supports you might have, and maybe even talk a little bit about the democracy schools.
Well, our process is we don't enter communities and offer our help. You know, we can see that there are places that need it, and a lot more than we have the capacity to help. So we're usually approached by someone in a community, and often enough, they've gathered a handful or more in their community who want to do something about it. So we have a discussion about what CELDF can offer. And I won't go through all that for time here, but it's, you know, give us an hour, we'll have a discussion, we'll let you know what it is we can do, what we can't do, what the process is, and maybe it's about developing a law for your county or municipality, and talk about the process for getting that enacted, the strategies and so forth. But first, you know, examining what it is that you're trying to, what problem you're trying to confront, and deciding what's the approach, because, you know, it's not just cookie cutter. We don't hand folks a template and say, go for it. It's about working with the community, and just talking about strategy. Education is really important. So the democracy school is about exposing the roots, the origins of the laws and the concepts in law that prohibit us from protecting our own communities and our own health and safety. And there is a real history there. Now, we're in the United States, and so we tell the story of the development of the US government and a lot of the mechanisms that have been used there. In Canada, it's a little bit different history, but there sure are a lot of parallels between the ways that municipalities relate to provinces. In other words, in the US, we call it Dillon's rule, which is that municipalities have the same status in relationship to the states as a child has to a parent. They have no legal agency of their own. They cannot make any decisions of their own. They must get permission from their parents for everything. That's the way it is in every municipality in the United States, despite what you might think. Superficially, it may look like, well, you get to elect people. The people we elect regularly tell their constituents, we wish we could help, but our hands are tied. And their hands are tied because of this Dillon's rule relationship. It's very similar in Canada, the relationship between municipalities, counties, and provinces. And if you don't own and run the province, you can't control your hometown. What it comes down to. So how did we get there? It's important to understand that. That's what we try to uncover in the educational process, and so that we can understand how we might get out of this situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know, I think this is maybe the third or fourth call that I've had with folks from CELDF. So you've been really helpful for me and the people who've been following this conversation with the rights of nature here in our region. I just want to mention that so Colin and Adam and Lindsay Lee, who's on the call there too, you know, we were some of the core members of a conversation that began around rights of nature efforts here in the Atlantic Canada region. And so Colin and Adam are kind of heading up this network. It has a Facebook page, and now has an email address. So people can connect both with that Facebook group and reach out to Adam and Colin using that email, Rights of Nature Network AC@gmail.com. And Ali, if you want to put our Atlantic@Sierra Club email address at sierraclub.ca address in the chat as well. Our newsletters will share some of the things we spoke about here this evening and some links. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to host some further conversations on the rights of nature and community rights, and bring in some folks from around here who are fighting these fights. And in fact, I know of a few communities already that have actually drafted Bill of Rights. And so there's definitely some thinking there, and people arrive at this after a long and difficult journey, having tried every, proper channel in the book, and not getting anywhere. So maybe, I know I kept everybody on a little extra long here, but maybe we'll end it here and stay in touch by email and Facebook, and hopefully another call before long. So Tish, Ben, Markie, thank you very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And each time we speak, I go away thinking, oh, so I'm not crazy. Well,
maybe a little, Tynette, maybe a little.
All right.
But that's a good thing.
It's very reassuring, to hear you folks talk. And as I shared with you yesterday in a call, and those of you who got our Atlantic Activist e-newsletter yesterday, this is a paint color from Home Depot made by Bayer that is called Climate Change. So not only is are things getting co-opted, but things are becoming normalized a little too fast too. We can't accept that climate change is normal and that there's nothing we can do about it, or that ecological disasters are a fait accompli. So I enjoy working with you and all the folks around here who really are fighting the good fight. So thank you all, and good night, everybody. This webinar, in addition to having been live streamed, has been recorded, and we'll make the link available. And we'll also let people know how they can see the documentary Invisible Hand if you didn't get to see it in the last 24 hours. Okay.
Thanks.
Good night,
Night.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.